Good evening and welcome to this live stream. Can you believe it's nearly it's nearly the end of the year? No, it's not quite the end of the year. It just feels like it at the moment. There is so much going on, so much going on. It's the 9th of July, actually, but it feels like September at least. We had a week of summer, and now it's back to winter in the UK as well, which is pretty typical this time of year. Anyway, before I bring Veronica in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific financial or property or legal advice. It's the general conversation only. We do moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions and comments into the chat. And if you'd like to make sure that the question is seen, if you use that Walk the World, that comes into my queue and that'll get my attention. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really, really important conversation to have. And at the moment, it's probably never been more important than now. And just for those of you who may not remember, I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. And, we do these live shows every week. With that out the way, let me bring Veronica in and we can get started. Veronica, hi there.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for coming back on again. It's been a few months, but I don't know what you think about the property market, but I have to say I'm getting more and more uncomfortable about what's happening at the moment. And I actually think the risks are quite high for a lot of people who may not be thinking about this very accurately. So we're going to explore that. But before we do that, Veronica, I need you to introduce yourself because, boy, your portfolio of activity is so long now, I don't know where to start.
I know I'm a very busy person. So basically I'm a real estate agent and I operate in many different spheres of the residential real estate sector in Australia. And my role really is to help people make really good property decisions. So I have a buyer's agency based in Sydney. I'm also setting up a property management business, which is being launched this month. I also have an online course for first home buyers to teach them the process to go through to buy their first property without falling into the very easy and yet avoidable pitfalls. I have a program to train or teach new buyers agents the skills that they need to do the job properly. I think that's it. I've got a couple of podcasts. I'll drop a few names as we go, if that's all right with you, Martin.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the fact is that you are over the property market like a rash, right? But you're looking at it from quite a few different perspectives almost at the same time, first-time buyers, from a buyer's agent perspective, from the price dynamic perspective, and through the Elephant in the Room podcast with Chris, looking at it more broadly too. You get a lot of guests coming on. So what's your top takeaway as to where we are at the moment in the property environment in Australia? And I guess we should always say immediately, it's not a property market, it is property markets plural.
It is indeed property markets plural. My top takeaway is that there's a lot of rhetoric at the moment about rental crisis and supply crisis and housing crisis. And I'm not saying there isn't a series of crises that people are trying to contend with. The problem is that the rhetoric isn't solving the problem. I don't think politicians have a really good handle on what the problem is. They've done a good job of helping create the problem. And as an individual trying to operate within this environment, you can rail against it, you can get mad about it, you can be upset about it, you can do all sorts of things. The problem is you can't beat it. And so I think, my approach to life really is about being very pragmatic. So if you want a home, you want a roof over your head, and you want to not make huge financial mistakes in the process of doing so, then you've got to learn the rules of the game. You've got to learn how to play it within your means and how you can best, harness what's going on to get you where you want to be. So I guess that's sort of my take of the whole thing. But it is a shit fight, if I can say that, for a lot of people. It really is a terrible situation for a lot of people, but railing against that is not going to solve it, and it's not going to solve it on an individual basis either. So you really got to look to on an individual basis about how to solve it for you. And I guess that's my take, which is it's not going to fill anybody with hope, is it really?
Well, the point there is that there is a macro story here of government failure over 20 to 30 years, right? And that's been driven by, well, the deregulation of the financial system so people can borrow more. It's been driven by lack of supply of property. It's been driven by ultra low interest rates, which are now very, very high. It's driven by high migration, all of those macro situations. But if you're an individual and you're trying to make a decision about, do I buy, do I not buy, do I trade up, do I trade down, that macro story is only of minor significance, right? Because you can't solve migration, you can't solve the supply issue, you can't actually solve government policy, or if government's handing out money to first-time buyers or not. What you have to try and do is navigate the stormy waters as best you can. So there is a very important conversation about how do you think about things in the current environment. And I called this show deliberately the property game, right? Because I actually do think you got to think of it almost like a game, right? You've got to understand what the rules of the game are. You've got to understand who the other players are. And you've got to understand what your winning hand might or might not be vis-a-vis other people. And I'm afraid that's the state of play, right? But the danger is that you can fall off. And at the moment, through my one-to-one conversations, I'm having more and more people who, for various reasons, have made really, really bad decisions. They thought they were the right decisions at the time, but when they stand back and think about them, they've realized that they've made really bad decisions. Now, I can't necessarily relay individual stories. So what I've tried to do is to build a series of scenarios, if you like, in the way of questions that try and actually encompass some of the things that I've seen. And I want to get your reaction and thoughts in terms of what that might be, because I actually think this is a really, really significant time. And, honestly, a lot of people, I think, Veronica, are making really, really bad decisions.
Look, I agree with you, and I do quite a lot of private or personal strategy sessions with people as well, and they often come to me after having done made a lot of decisions and sometimes bought a number of properties in good faith in terms of thinking, okay, well, this is what I need to do in order to create wealth with property, and then these decisions, they never reveal themselves to be good or bad or indifferent immediately. It takes a good 5 or 10 years before people realise whether they have in fact made wise decisions. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, and this is a fairly common scenario, a young couple with small children, they've been renting in Sydney, rents have been rising, they've realised that, this is really a very untenable situation, and it's tenuous too, because they've got children at schools, and they don't want to have that rental insecurity. So they think, well, now I need to buy a property to live in. But what they've done years ago, instead of buying a home to live in and a small home and then trading up or doing the stepping stone strategy, as we call it, they've decided to invest instead. And so a number of these people have got maybe 2, sometimes 3 investment properties, generally not A-grade properties. Generally, they often have engaged buyers agents to actually help them buy these properties. They're often real cookie-cutter type properties, nothing particularly unique or particularly, investment grade about them. And they then need to go and sell those properties a lot earlier than they would otherwise have sold them, because, of course, you want to buy property for the long term, assuming you buy a good enough asset. And so in order for them to actually be able to have a home to live in, they've got to offload these properties. They've all owned for sub 10 years. So they haven't really done much for them. And some of them in areas which are, say in Southeast Queensland, where there might have recently been some growth, but, for a big chunk of the time, these people that own them, they haven't seen any growth. So they sell them, they might get a bit of a gain, but then they've got to pay capital gains tax on that gain. And then they've got to turn around and reinvest that money back into, their owner-occupied home. If you wind back and think, if they just actually bought a home for themselves back then, even if it was, a well-positioned unit, for argument's sake, and, I could model out various scenarios that they could have gone through back then versus what they did do, and they would have been better off. And the sad thing is that the people advising them to get into investing rather than owning their own home, you know, they had a vested interest, of course, in these people choosing investment properties over owner-occupied home. So that's really sad. And I come across that type of scenario a lot of times. And I'm sure you come across very similar things, Martin. So when people make these decisions early on in their lives and they squirrel away and they do all the things that in good faith they think are doing to set themselves up financially, and then to only discover that they've really lost a good 10 years of their runway, that's really sad.
Yes. And there is a implicit question in what you're saying, which is, what is property for ultimately? Right? And I think that's a really, really important question just to reflect on, right? Because more and more the conversations I'm having with people, it's in I need somewhere to live. I've got a growing family, that's the critical imperative, rather than the one which is property is a freewheeling way of trying to actually increase my investment wealth, right? Now, those two things, sometimes they marry, but quite often they don't marry very well. And so one of my conversation points with people in my one-to-ones is to try and actually get from them what they're thinking property is ultimately about. Because actually, the story of what you do will be determined a little bit by how you think property is and what it's for.
Yeah, very true. But also people make property decisions with very short-term horizons, very short-term thinking. I was talking to a woman just the other day who has got two properties, the home she lives in, the home she used to live in before she moved into a bigger home. And she's talking about selling the home that she previously lived in, right? But she actually doesn't have good accounting advice. She has got agents pressuring her to sell, and one's got a buyer supposedly with an offer on the table. She doesn't know what a good offer is. But when I said to her, I said, look, what is your plan for the process of the sale? Like, what are you going to do next? And she's like, well, I don't know, because the other house I'm in is not my forever home, and I don't know where that's going to be because my kids aren't yet at school. And I'm like, well, why would you go and make a big decision like selling a property without actually having a plan? You've already got the property. The hard work's been done in getting it, so it's a decent enough property, right? Once you sell, you're out of it. It's the revolving, it's like the turnstile going into a football stadium, right? You go through the turnstile, you can see where you came from, but you can't go back there, not without going all the way around again. And but she's not alone. She's busy, she's stressed, she's got a small family and she works, and she's like, I don't have time to think these things through. And I'm horrified to think that people are just going to make very quick, rash decisions. And she's not the only person. I've come across many, many people. And usually when they're under stress as well and they think that they've only got a limited number of options, they don't even realise they have more options available to them. And it's only afterwards they sit back and they've got a little bit of perspective, a little bit of that hindsight. They went, oh, I could have done it differently. And I guess that's what I'm out there trying to protect people from. This is someone who already owns a property, selling out of that. Take it carefully, think it through, really consider the implications, what your long-term plan is. Get some good advice from an accountant around tax, because she asked her a number of questions she didn't have answers to, so she obviously doesn't have good advice there. And make considered decisions. And on the investing side too, you talk about people's mindset around what is property for? And yes, it is shelter and a home. And it's been conflated in this country because we do have the great Australian dream, not just to own our own home on a quarter acre block. Mind you, that's not really the thing anymore. But now we've also got the thing about we want to own our own home and an investment property. That's like the great Australian dream. And so it is all conflated with investment and home, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that, even investing, we've got to be thinking about our lifestyle and what our ultimate goals are in terms of how we want to live. And it is about living, rather than just accumulation, rather than doing it because you should and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, I agree. There's just not enough thought goes into a lot of these decisions. And it's a reason why there are so many property spruikers out there that are able to basically profit and make money from making all this stuff sound easy, And so we set ourselves up for this. We set ourselves up to be sold to. We set ourselves up to be conned because we're not prepared to put the work in ourselves, to really put some heavy thinking into it to make better decisions. That's a long rant based on what you said there.
No, but it's spot on. It's interesting. You might be amused that some of those property spruikers actually buy adverts on my shows, right?
I noticed.
because obviously, you know, when we're talking about this stuff, we sometimes attract people who are interested in property, but can then be quite easily misled when the spruikers come out and say, well, you buy 5 properties and you buy another 5 and you leverage up, and, you know, and I've made, you know, look at the millions I've made in 10 years. And, you know, it's not actually real, right? And so it's really, really important to really get back to some basics here, right? Now, I thought a good way to do that, and, you know, what we want to do over the next chunk of the show, is to just look at a few different examples where we've actually got a problem, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it. And so I'm going to put one up. This is Laura. Now, Laura isn't her real name, but the scenario is relatively similar to one that I had a conversation previously. So they're 38, right? They're renters. They're paying $1,250 a week for a small unit in Redfern. That's quite a lot, but, you know, that's what Redfern is like. They've already had a 15% increase in rent last year, next one coming in December. They both work in the centre of Sydney. They've saved some money for a deposit, and they want to buy a house and, you know, with space to have kids. They're looking at Western Sydney, sort of a couple of hours travel time out. Off the plan, newly built, but the prices are high and the banks won't lend enough. So they could tap their parents, but even after that, they're struggling to make the sums add up with the extra travel costs, with the extra costs of running the property. And basically the question was, what are we doing wrong? You know, have we got something fundamentally out of kilter here in terms of trying to understand what to do and how to think about it? What's your reaction to that story?
Well, I think about how much rent they're paying and, you know, what you could repay, what sort of loan you could repay with that as repayments as opposed to rent. And that must have pretty good incomes too, because that's a lot of after-tax dollars going in rent. So personally, you know, I look at someone like that and I think the very first thing you have to do is get a really good broker who can help you understand your borrowing capacity. Look at the ways you can get help. So look at your parents and talk to your parents about, well, what does help look like in a meaningful way? Is it a gift? Is it a loan? Is it a co-ownership? Is it what is it? And what are the strings attached to that as well? I mean, just explore the help. Explore the help from the government too. I mean, and I'm not a fan of the first home buyer incentives that encourage you to buy off the plan or brand new. In fact, I really do not like those incentives, but for example, maybe they qualify for the 5%, the government's underwriting the LMI, the lender's mortgage insurance. So I would explore those options, and with a really good mortgage broker who specialises in first home buyers, not a really good mortgage broker who specialises in telling first home buyers where all the free money is from the government, but one that actually helps them with a long-term view and around borrowing strategy to firstly understand what they're playing with, you know, because to then go out there and go, right, I'm going to go and live in way out west when you've been living in the inner city, which is Redfern. I mean, that's cultural cringe. But I mean, just in the sense of lifestyle, you've got everything on your doorstep versus you going out where everything is requiring travel in a car. That's cultural cringe in my view, you know. There's just a totally different way of life. And I've known people that have actually gone from living in inner city areas in apartments and gone and bought houses out of suburbia and then realised that it's not what they imagined, you know, because that doesn't have the same connectivity, for argument's sake. People don't actually talk to each other quite as much because they've got more space inside their houses. They don't go out as much. They don't use the parks as much. It's just a different way of living. And so that might work for you, but you can't make assumptions that it will and just go out there, because then you can be stuck. And so I guess the first thing for me is to say, okay, what is the potential? What could you borrow? What could you purchase in terms of purchasing capacity budget, shall we say, and then start doing an exercise of working it through what your options are. Look closer in, where the lifestyle sits. Could you live in a unit, a bigger unit with a child? I mean, in other countries, people do. It's just Australians, we always think we need a backyard. Like, could you? It may be the answer is no, but you could look in the middle ring and think, is there a townhouse in your budget? Are there other ways in which you could find different areas that still offer lifestyle that fit with what fit with what you're used to, fit with your commute, all that sort of stuff, without thinking you have to buy a house? So there's other ways of looking at this. And so I guess we have a little tutorial in Home Buyer Academy called Where to Buy. It literally helps you work through this conundrum of the 3 Ps. We call it price, property, and position. And that's the location, the property itself, and your budget. And working through a process of what your options are for different price points and different types of properties in different locations, so that you can arrive at really what is the right solution for you. And so, like, that little workshop's $39. It's not expensive, but it takes you through a whole process that we go through in my buyer's agency business. We do that for our clients, and it's really, really important to understand what your possibilities are. So just assuming that you have to go from one extreme, which is a tiny apartment in the middle of the city, to the outer extreme, which is a house and land package on the outskirts of the city, is quite dramatic. I think there's a lot of other things to explore between Redfern and the outer extents of Sydney. So that's sort of a couple of things that I would throw there at the minute.
Yeah.
What did you advise them, Martin?
I said your chalk and cheese, right? Going from Redfern to the outer west. How many times have you been out there? Have you ever driven from the west into the centre of Sydney at rush hour? Oh, haven't done that. Well, you don't know what it's going to be like. I can tell you that you can easily spend 2 hours just to get in, right?
Yep.
What's the cost?
Yes.
Yeah. What's the cost of 2 cars rather than 1 car? Those sorts of things. And then the other point is with the home and land offers that are out there, prices out in the West are still relatively high and still rising. There's a significant risk if you go home and land package, of course, for all sorts of reasons that and I from the point of view, and we'll touch on another scenario a little later. So my thought was think broader, which is exactly what you said, right? What about closer in? Even if you don't find that, world of dreams house with, 4 bedrooms and the land and everything else, maybe there's an interim step here that would actually get you into the property, because you want to own property rather than actually be at the behest of the landlord. And as you say, that rent was a very shockingly high rent. Although interestingly, I don't know whether you saw this was actually data came out today. How much money do you need to buy in my capital city? And they said that in Sydney, for an average, $238,800 a year is the salary that you need to be able to afford to buy at the moment. So that's just the shocking story. It's cheaper in Melbourne, 159,000, and Brisbane, 125,000. So Brisbane's more. Even in Perth, 154,000. But the point about that was that this just makes the point that this is not a simple equation, right? And so rather than jumping from one solution to another solution, think more broad, right? Then do your sums, because I was formed the view, having spoken to them, was they had the capacity to actually buy something, but not necessarily what they were thinking they wanted to buy.
Yeah. Yes. That's where that whole exercise of really working out what your possibilities are is so important, because so many assumptions. That's what people operate out of, assumptions, and also just what other people are doing and what you think you should do and all that sort of stuff. And it's all of that needs to be interrogated. We find it in Home Buyer Academy. So we've got first home buyers doing our course there, and we do a little campfire every week and we talk to them about what they're looking at buying, and it's quite incredible. They're a bunch of can-do people. These people have got good savings habits. They've got good good budget hygiene or financial hygiene, if you want to call it that. They typically the people that do our course actually are overthinkers. They like to research. So they're very relieved when they do actually bite the bullet and buy the course and start doing, because they're like, oh, this organises all the thinking, all the learning, all the listening, all the reading I've been doing. This actually puts it all into context, puts it all into really manageable bite-sized chunks so I can follow a process. But it is interesting that you have to follow a process to actually think through these things quite logically and understand how things operate so that you can make better decisions, because that is quite knee-jerky. It's like, okay, well, that must be what we do. We have to then go and buy a house and land package in order to have children. You know what I mean? And it's a really common thought process, but it is a fallacy and it can lead people to real problems.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the context here was when I asked them, so why did you think you needed to go out west and buy a home and land package, right? They were actually reacting to some of the friends that they have who've already done it.
Yeah.
And I actually asked the question, have you spoken to them about the experience and what it's been? Oh, I didn't do that. Well, don't just follow them blindly out to the west,
Interesting.
Do a little bit more research. So it's really quite important.
Totally. Oh, it was good. We're on the same page there, Martin.
Yep.
We gave you very similar advice. That's good.
Well, let's try the next one then, because this is another really, I think, quite significant and interesting one. This is from Steve. I've got a 3-bedroom house in Northern Beaches, right? It's worth about $3 million, 80% mortgage, fixed term, end 24. But they need extra room for growing family, not an extra room, but extra room, several rooms. They're in their early 40s. So the dilemma is, do we extend where we are or do we try and trade up? Income's pretty strong, but it is variable due to various commissions. And the banks would be willing to lend more. But the question he posed was, so what are the questions we should be asking? It's hard to find a suitable house that we actually aspire to. So do we try and trade up or do we try and expand the place we've actually got?
So my guess is that if he's got a LVR of 80%, then potentially he hasn't owned this house very long.
Yep.
And so it's another example of not thinking about the longer term or at least the medium term when you buy a property. He's already outgrown it. Now, I made this mistake with my first property. I outgrew it in a year, right? But this is the consequence of buying without necessarily considering that longer term. So he's already in very high debt, and to trade out of that property to upgrade, a lot of the equity that he has is going to get chewed up in transaction costs. He'll probably find himself having to pay LMI, So I guess the very first thing I always look at, say, find out what you can afford to do first. And it might be that he can afford to sell it and trade up. It might be that is the smart thing to do, right? But it might not be as well. But certainly you need to explore that. And he's already said he's finding it hard to see what he wants to buy. And again, I'd recommend a similar process I recommended for Laura, which was go through that exercise of working out and learning about what the possibilities are for your property search. You need to actually research the types of properties you get in the locations, looking at recent sales, not at what's on the market for sale. I like to make that distinction. And for what price, and looking at recent sales to determine that. And if you can't see anything that you like that has sold recently, then don't sell, don't go trading up, because what you're looking for is a unicorn, or, it just doesn't exist. So a lot of people have this idea that I'm going to do this, but they don't actually, none of the decision-making is rooted in any evidence. There's no actual evidence that what you want to buy exists or it exists within your budget. Or, so you really got to make sure that you have accurate expectations as to what you can buy. But also, if he's going to be selling, that just adds complexity. The other people were renting. This guy's got to sell. I'm presuming he would have to sell the property. So you've got to have very, very accurate expectations on your sale price as well, because you need to be thinking about, okay, I'm needing to sell. Do I buy before I sell? Do I sell before I buy? If so, who am I going to take advice from in terms of what the property's worth? And that's dangerous because sales agents are the ones that come through and give you an appraisal, and yet sales agents aren't known for giving you the truth before you sign on the dotted line because they're competing for your business and they have to be judicious with the truth, otherwise they're never going to get a listing. So we do a lot of vendor advisory work, so I speak to this because we do a lot of this stuff, right, where we help people work out, should you sell, right? Try asking a sales agent whether you should sell. Of course you should sell, of course. And when should you sell? You should always sell now. But the market's crap. It's going to get worse. But the market's fantastic. I want to wait until it peaks. Oh, but it's going to fall off the cliff any minute now. I mean, there's always a reason why you should sell today, right? So it's very difficult to get advice, unbiased advice. So that's what Steve has to be thinking. Okay, I need a really accurate idea about what my property is worth if I had to sell it for a fire sale. I need a really accurate idea as to what I can get, where I can get it, how much I'm going to need. Can I afford that? Is that feasible? And then if those things all line up, then sure, upgrade, because that's easier and quicker than renovating and extending, right? But if you've got a decent 3-bedroom home or a decent block of land in a good location, then and you enjoy living there, and there's potential to extend that property within budget, and you've got the time to do it because it will take longer. Maybe that's an option, and there's transaction costs, obviously, in buying and selling that you lose, if you want to call it that. Certainly when you go to extend, you're going to lose costs such as your consultant fees. You're going to lose costs such as, renting somewhere else while you're renovating. So there's costs that you're going to, if you want to use the word, lose in both scenarios. And in fact, construction costs have gone up. It's hard to find builders, all that sort of palaver. So the cost of renovating is going up. So you need to go through both exercises, really work out what the possibilities are and what fits with your budget, what is possible. And that's probably, I don't think I've missed anything that I was thinking of when I looked at that question.
Yeah, interesting. And so in this conversation, I actually asked him the question, well, let's say you bought a bigger property, I don't know, 3.5 million, let's say. Do you know what the stamp duty on that would be?
Yeah.
Right? Oh, no, I didn't. Well, didn't really have much idea of that. And then I said, well, so have you found anything that might actually suit your needs in the area that you want? No, we've been looking quite hard, but haven't found anything. Okay, so chances are for the amount that you've actually been able to trade up to, you probably can't find something that would actually fit your bill. Right, as you say, Veronica, there are no unicorns out there. It's not unicorn season at the moment. Now, then I asked the question about, so, how much more room do you need, really? And that's what we got into a really interesting conversation, because it's then found that the wife was the one who was pushing for a lot more room. But actually, they didn't really need as much more room as they really thought about it. Once they'd actually gone into the conversation and, some quite hard conversations about, well, why do you need, what do you need? And they actually ended up realizing that they could actually just literally add one room at the back of the property. They had quite a lot of land, right? And they got a quote to do that. And the quote was actually relatively reasonable from a respectable builder who they knew. And they were able to do it within 3 months. And so they stayed put, and they saved themselves the best part of $500,000 in doing this all up, right? They like the place they're in. They've now got the extra room. And it was actually a fascinating conversation, because going from I got to trade up, that was their assumption, right? To, well, actually, maybe there were alternatives. Was actually a really, really interesting conversation, right? And you could see the sort of the cogs turning. And do you know what had happened? They got infected by an agent who was really keen to help them, right? And gave them quite an elevated valuation for the property that they actually had, and was very keen to find them. So they were actually being led by the nose by an agent who was being driven, I think, more by their own motivation rather than helping Steve and his wife out with the decision. And it shows you again, you can easily get trapped.
Mm. Not only that, I mean, when you've got little kids too, you're meeting other people with little kids. You're not going out as much as you might have gone out before. A lot of people are entertaining at home, inviting other people with their little kids over to their houses. And there's this comparison game that goes on. So, yeah, and, sometimes it can all be very unconscious, and then you sort of snap out of it a bit sometimes, step back and think, oh, I'm just being lulled into or sucked into this sort of comparison game. And it's dangerous. It's compelling, but dangerous. And I think also I come across so many people who have been lured into selling or into engaging with agents where they weren't really that serious about selling, but they were sort of just thinking about it a little bit. Now, a lot of agents are very good at encouraging you to just give them access to show their database, because somebody might actually give you one of those really amazing offers and maybe entice you to sell, right? And I've seen agents get people on the hook that weren't really committed to selling, and once you take just that little select group of buyers through, just a little handful of buyers, just a handful, not my full database, these people have just missed out on other properties. And then, oh, no, they're not quite the ones, it's not quite right for them. But I tell you what, though, I do know there are other people in my database. And if you gave me a 2-week listing, we can just do that just off market. That's all we'll do. And it's this sort of, it's warming up the frog in the pot, right? And so after 2 weeks, when you've had a few people through, maybe a few little sniffs, but you think, you know what, this is really encouraging. They really like it. I tell you what, they're skipping around this sort of price. If you actually went through an auction campaign and got real competition, I think you'd be amazed at what price you could get. This has been really well received, this house. And then the next thing you know, they're in an auction campaign. I've seen it happen. And it's like, how did you get to the point? Sometimes they ring me halfway through the campaign and they're like, where should I set the reserve, Veronica? And I'm like, okay, let's just ask you a few questions, none of which they can really answer. And it's like, what? Why did you list your property? Oh, well, we were thinking we might do. And been led upon, down this path, and now they're at this point. And I'm like, have you really thought this through? Are you really ready to sell? Do you know exactly what your next step is? Are you ready for that next step? I am amazed at how many people can be led through the nose, really. It's scary.
Well, it is, and I think it's getting worse. And I think underquoting, and I think the imperative in a low listings market to try and get any listing you can, is part of it from an agent's perspective. The other point I make quite often is that people, might decide to sell without knowing where they're going to jump to.
Yeah, that's the thing.
And in the current environment, that's a huge risk.
Yeah. So listings have been on the decline for some time now, just generally in Australia. We say it's not one Australian property market, but generally in Australia, like it's not, I don't know, you might know better than me, Martin, when, but I'm thinking around about 5-6 years ago, on average, we used to have transactions around about 600,000 properties transact every year in Australia. And of recent years, that's gone down to 500,000. In fact, one year, I think it was down to 460,000. Like it was so low. But it's sort of, it's averaged, or it's sort of leveled out a little bit now, around 500,000 per year. Now, so we've got 11 million properties. Roughly the value of the market is 11 trillion, or not quite, but almost getting there. 11 million properties is what's a few zeros, right? And so that's less than 5% of transacting every year. And that is reducing, and agents, their commissions hurting, and sales agencies are actually under a lot of pressure for profit. And obviously, when there's less listings, there's more downward pressure on their commissions, their fees. And there's still a lot of agents to go around with less listings, and they have come up with some very clever tactics for getting people to commit to selling their property. It's always been an issue that agents will overpromise and underdeliver. This idea of conditioning the vendor has always been a practice, and there's been legislation across the board to try to stamp this out, but it still pervades, right? It continues, and part of the reason it continues is because we love to be flattered, and we want more money than our property is really worth, So we play our part in this, But what happens, the agent comes through and they often don't do a proper appraisal. They'll pluck figures out of the air that they think that we want to hear. And then we sign an agency agreement, and depending on where you are, there's a cooling off period on that agency agreement, or there may not be, but it's like, say, a 2-day cooling off period. Well, nothing's happened in 2 days. By the time that agent starts telling you that, buyers don't really like the steep driveway. Oh, buyers don't really like the the block of, we call them a flock of bats, the block of flats over the back, the back lane. Oh, buyers don't really like this stuff. And it's like the vendor turns to the agent and says, well, you knew all this when you listed it. Why are you suddenly telling me now? Oh, I really didn't think that buyers would be so picky about that, but that they really are at the moment. So that's really surprised me. It's too late. The owner's already committed. There's some cost involved. You're on this program by then, and so. And this is why we do a lot of vendor advisory work, because it's like, don't make decisions with only half the information. If you're going to make a decision to sell a property, make sure you got all the information, you get everything, all the ingredients right, then you're going to maximize your outcome. And it might not be what you really want to get for it, but you're going to get it right, and you're going to get your campaign right, and you're going to get the best possible outcome, right? But unfortunately, there's just a lot of wishful thinking that goes on, and we humans are pretty sad at falling for this stuff. And that's one of the reasons why agents, at the moment in particular, there's a lot of this going on, because they need the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because, I sold and bought actually in 2 different continents, and was able to manage the process as a project over about 6 months, right? There's a lot to do to be able to make it all fall in the right place at the right time with the right outcomes, right? So I was able to complete, on the purchase of the new property on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday moved out of the old one, Thursday settled on the old one, and Friday it was all over. And I flew half around the world in the meantime. Now,
that doesn't happen easily. It might have seemed easy and smooth at the time, but like you said, a 6-month lead up to get all those ducks lined up.
It is a project. Yeah, exactly. And I had my my spreadsheets, and I had my Gantt charts and all those sorts of things. What do I need to do when, and et cetera, et cetera. And also the question is, what if this doesn't happen? What happens? Yeah. So, for example, I have a grand piano, right? And I got a phone call on the Tuesday that I was actually moving out from the removers, who'd promised that they'd actually be able to remove the grand piano. And they said, oh, we don't remove the piano until next week. I said, no, you can't do that. That's not going to work, right? And I had to run around quickly and basically beat them up, and they found a way of doing it. This is not straightforward. Yeah, so it is interesting. Let's go on to another example, right? Because I want to really try and get to the questions behind the questions that we keep coming back to, because you start to see that there are people who know that there are questions that they should be asking. So this is the next one. This is from Jo. So she's trading down, and she lost her husband last year, lives in a large 4-bed house. It's in Bankston. It's worth about $2.5 million. It's mortgage free, but it's too big. So looking to get something smaller, not a unit, in the same area, but it's not turning up anything that fits. So plus wanting to pull out some equity into super, with the break there that you've got, you can put money into super from a down trader. So the questions that she's wrestling with is, do I compromise on the property location and type? Or do I stay put, even though I don't need the space now? And actually, I think this is a really classic problem that I'm getting quite often into my one-to-one conversations. I know that I've got a big property. It's too big for me, but I can't find a way out.
And this is often the case with people that have been in the big suburban home for a long time, brought up their kids, probably had grandkids come in there as well. And in that area, you've got big suburban homes or you've got units. There's sort of not a lot in between. And if that's the case, as it might be there, that's why you can't find it. They don't exist. The in-between houses don't exist. And, there's a lot of argument about developers not building enough of different types of strata properties, so different size strata properties, to give those opportunities for downsizers to stay in areas. So I guess I'd ask the question, again, it's a bit like saying the theme here is the unicorn, looking for the unicorn, right? If it can't find it and you've been looking for it, it's probably not there. And so I'd be saying, why not a unit, right? Why not? And a lot of people, units can be terrible investments. Like, don't get me wrong. And units can have real problems with defects, et cetera, et cetera. Don't get me wrong. However, a lot of people's reason for not wanting to buy a unit is simple as, because I don't want to pay strata fees, or, I don't really want to live close to neighbours. And so I've got two counter arguments of both of those. The neighbours one, let's get this one. If you've got neighbours that are close to you and you live in a suburban street and your neighbours are doing something you don't want them to do, say they're hoarders, say they play loud music, you got Buckleys getting them to change, right? You got Buckleys that getting them to quieten down or put away their hoarding. Whereas if you're in a strata complex, there are usually what do you call them, body there's a body corporate, there's an owners corporation, there's bylaws, that's the word I was looking for. There are usually bylaws that help govern the way people live in those areas. And you may not want these restrictions, but I'll tell you what, you got more control over what your neighbour does in terms of impinging on your privacy and enjoyment, quiet enjoyment of your lot in a strata plan than you do in a suburban street. So that's just something that I'd just throw out there, that sometimes it's better to be in a strata situation. And when it comes to levies are a great way of budgeting the ownership costs of having a property. And I think what a lot of people misunderstand when they have a house is how much maintenance a house requires.
Yep.
Now, you're paying insurance for that property anyway. You're paying building insurance. That's covered by your strata levies. But also, you don't tend to go and get a capital works fund forecast for maintaining your own home. Like, it's a really good idea to do something like that, right? But you don't tend to do it. People don't go and get a quantity surveyor to work out when they're going to need to replace their roof, when they're going to need to repaint the whole building, when the windows will need replacing, when all that sort of stuff, right? And the gardening, getting your gutters cleaned, all of those things. If you added them up when you, and particularly now she's in a big home all by herself that she has to maintain, because to preserve the value of that property, you've got to continue to maintain it. If you added all of those costs up and the insurance cost, I've done it on my own home, by the way. I actually think there are a number of unit complexes I could quite happily move into, and my levies would be roughly the same as what I'm paying just to maintain and insure my house as it is. So I think I just would challenge people just to, instead of that assumption it's just a pure cost, it's like you should be incurring costs in maintaining your own home anyway. And in order to preserve it or keep it in peak condition and preserve its value. And so that's just another way of looking, I guess, at strata levies. So I would say that if they're the only two objections to living in a unit, that's the first thing I'd say. Let's challenge that assumption and go out there and have a look at some units if you really want to stay in that area. And that's where your network is, and that's where you know where everybody is and where your hairdressers and your doctor and your chemist and all that sort of stuff are. That might be a really good solution.
Yeah, it's interesting because I sort of had a somewhat similar thought. And so I pushed a bit on how important is the locale, right? Mm. And it transpired that the locale was absolutely critical because of the fact that the social network was there, her friends were there, doctors and everything else, right? Yeah. So the location was the number one point. I said, okay, well, if the location is the number one point, then you've got to actually see what's available. And the problem is you either have units or you have these larger properties, right? Yes. So then I went down precisely the track that you went on. Well, let's talk to me about units. Why is it that units aren't actually what you want, right? And we went through all of the things. And one of the things that she was concerned about was the noise and also the quality of construction, right? But actually, the net result of all this was that she decided that maybe finding the right unit, and she did actually find a unit, ground floor unit with a garden, right? Small, older block, some strata fees, but the maths worked. And so she actually ended up essentially compromising on the type of property, but actually ended up in a lower maintenance alternative, right? Because now the strata guys are worrying about the externalities of the building,
Exactly.
right? And the bulk of the gardens, etc., other than the bit that she owns, attached to the flat. So essentially, you had to shift the dial on your thinking.
Yeah.
And for me, this is one of the most important lessons of playing the property game right? You've got to ask yourself, what assumptions are you making and why are you assuming that the answer is what you think it is, right? Because sometimes if you think about it differently, you can come to a better solution. So she was able to downscale. She was able to put the money into superannuation, which was good. She had a bit of working cash available and just less worry about maintaining the property. So shows you, but you've got to break the pattern of your thinking.
That's exactly right. And the problem is too that everybody's got opinions when it comes to property, right? So depending on who she's speaking to, who might share the same assumptions, it just keeps reinforcing these beliefs. And like each of these people have been operating out of various assumptions that aren't necessarily correct and certainly are incomplete at the very least. And so, yeah, that's very true. I think I did write assumptions in all of these, in my notes when I read these questions. So it's spot on. It's just about opening up people's thinking, because it's like otherwise you got very closed thinking around property. And the reality is that most people are only exposed to their own microcosm, the area in which they operate and their beliefs and the people that share their beliefs and all that sort of stuff. And they don't often pull back and just think, there are different ways to skin this cat. Not that anyone wants to skin a cat, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, and look, the fact of the matter is that people often want to go and jump to a solution, right?
Yes.
It's I got a problem, I jump to a solution, right? Without actually asking, well, hang on a moment, what is the real issue that you're dealing with? And what are the various options that are available? So let's have a look at all those different ones before you jump to a solution. So that's the first point. The second point is, and just to pick up what you said earlier on, a decision that you take today echoes down the years, right? It's what's called a punctiliar action, right? It's a point in time, but it has consequences. And so one of the things that I quite often do in my one-to-ones is to ask about what are the consequences of doing X or Y, right? And sometimes people haven't thought through some of the follow-on consequences. So if I stay where I am, what happens in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, as the maintenance bill and as the as you age, et cetera, right? So it's a different landscape from the one that most people actually have in their minds when they think about, I need to buy a property.
Yeah. Do you know, in your First Home Buyer Guide, which is our online course for first home buyers, we've got 10 steps that we take people through. And step 5 is called revise and correct. And that is because after you've done a certain amount of learning and planning, then you get to the point to say, am I on the right track? Are my assumptions correct? Do I need to adjust and pivot and change what I'm looking for, where I'm looking, even the budget for that matter? And it's so interesting that, like, as we were Megan and I were putting that course together, and it just became so obvious that it was such an important a piece of the puzzle was to have a point at which you stop and test, were my assumptions correct? Am I on the right path? And we have the metaphor that you're climbing a mountain, and it's a bit like you get to a point where you think, hang on a minute, I might have just been going down a wrong path, might be leading me to a ravine rather than up the mountain. And let's just stop for a minute and reconsult the maps and make sure that I'm doing it, I'm actually going where I want to, in the direction in which I want to actually arrive. And it's amazing how many people have done the course, and then they've got their revise and correct story for us. They tell us how they've really changed, what they originally, all the assumptions they're originally working on versus what they ultimately ended up with, and how much a much better solution for them. We're so proud of those stories.
Yes, and have you got the map up the right way in the first place, right? It's always a good
Do you
question.
know where north is?
Exactly. Let's pick another one because I think this is quite fascinating as well. So this is actually a Yip from Melbourne. So bought 4 units in Docklands in 2017 off the plan, all mortgaged, initially on low fixed rates, but now on higher variable rates. No capital growth so far, and there are many vacant properties in the high rise. You know, they continue to build the high rise in the Docklands, so there's a lot of spare capacity there. 3 are let, one's not. They've been lifting rents annually, but seems to have reached a bit of a plateau in terms of what the rents can get to. Strata fee's still rising. And so from a cash flow perspective, they're actually all losing money, although you can offset the losses against tax. So the question is, you know, should I cut my losses and try and sell, or hold and hope that maybe values will begin to move up? I have to tell you that this is one of the most common dilemmas that I come across in my one-to-ones. And I could talk about Ryde in Sydney. I could talk about areas in Gold Coast, in Brisbane, even in the West over in Perth. You've bought the wrong investment properties probably.
Yeah. These are sold as investments, but they're not investments at all. And it's really tragic because I've heard similar stories from many people as well. And here we are, that's 7 years ago, not just one, but 4. You know, that's drinking the Kool-Aid, that one. Totally bought into the dream to buy 4 there, right?
And he got a significant discount by buying 4 at the same time.
Of course.
So, of course.
Yeah. So, you know, back in 2016, the first time I started becoming aware of how people could actually lose money in a marketplace where other people are making money. And I think the first time I started collecting data on the resales of off-the-plan apartments was Viz Shrapnel had some data out. It was back in 2016, so just the year before he bought these. And they were saying that something like, I'm trying to remember the exact number. It was huge. It was something like 40% of resales sold at a loss. And that was in a period of time where we were nearly all the way through a property boom. And so you got people losing money when the rest of the market is booming. And that's sort of the first time I went, oh, it's like 2-speed market. You've got people literally losing money while other people are literally making money in the same location. So what's the difference? It's in the asset choice in the first place. And so if Yip had done a bit of research at the time, that, you know, the warning signs were there. However, there's still plenty of people marketing these investment opportunities. And so, and unfortunately, when people are looking to buy off the plan, they're very rarely looking outside that silo. They're very rarely looking outside at established properties. They're very rarely comparing values, what you can buy established versus what you can buy off the plan. They're often falling for that line about, well, increased tax deductibility and depreciation, because obviously brand new does have additional depreciation benefits that even a year-old doesn't have, or 6 months old. So, you know, and so that for that reason, your off-the-plan buyer is fairly quarantined, if you like. They're not listening or hearing or aware of really what's happening in the rest of the marketplace. So that they're ignorant to that. So some better due diligence might have actually saved you, but however, he's you know, it's too late now. So people often think, okay, I need to hold on to this property because I've got to wait till it makes money and then I'll sell it, because then I feel better about the fact I made a bad decision in the first place. The problem is then you've got opportunity cost. So if you look, you know, he hasn't made any money since he's owned it. He waits another 7 years and still doesn't make any money. You know, if that's what happens, then he says, finally, okay, I'm willing to accept the loss. Or do you look at all the evidence around you that a lot of people have lost money in these properties, that if there's continued development, you know, how long am I going to wait before we're going to see any gain in these properties? That the whole Melbourne property market is currently struggling compared to the rest of the country, or most of the rest of the country. And also apartments in Melbourne have underperformed for some time. Now, ultimately, that will turn around. But will this type of apartment turn around? Possibly not. You've got to look at scarcity, you've got to look at the type of asset that you've got. So my thing there, generally speaking, Yip, I'd say you've got to be thinking about opportunity costs, and you've got to be thinking about, it's not so much, I'm glad he's used the term cut your losses, because it's horrible, and I'm not saying this with any joy, because I really do hate hearing these stories. But the reality is that there comes a time when you say, do you know what? My money would do better elsewhere. I'm better to sometimes realize losses now and take the money that I've got left and apply it in a different asset class, or it might be in a different type of property, but put it somewhere where it's actually going to work for me, rather than leave it somewhere where it's been proven that it hasn't worked for me. That's what I'd be thinking.
Yeah. And I have to say that this is one of the most common stories that I keep having from people who've bought the wrong investment properties, sold a dream by the development companies, in some cases, rental subsidies initially as well, just to sort of, support the deal. But the question is, are you buying something where there are going to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of similar properties being thrown up in the same area? That supply-demand disequilibrium suggests you're unlikely to make much on capital appreciation, at least in the short term. Now, even if you look over a 10-year period, there's significant risk here that you won't ever pull out of this, right? Because they're going to still go on building.
Yeah, and look, the thing too is that you've got the new stock gets then marketed to the next new wave of investors, in inverted commas, that come through and buy those properties. And they've got all the depreciation because they're shiny and new, and the federal government is more supportive, or our tax laws are, more supportive of buying brand new than they are buying existing stock. So, but to all intents and purposes, yours is still a contemporary apartment in the same location, but who's going to want to buy it? The first home buyer who gets the added benefits of buying brand new isn't going to go for yours. The investor who gets the added depreciation from buying brand new isn't going to go for yours. So your secondary market, the reason so many of them lose money on resale is because the secondary market just doesn't exist.
Yeah, spot on. And unfortunately, the risk is I made a bad decision, but I'm not going to actually recognize that bad decision. Sometimes cutting losses, which is precisely what he said, was the right solution. So I think
painful.
Very painful. So the idea was that one that's not let at the moment, maybe that's worth seeing whether you can move it, and that will tell you something about the market and what price point you'd have to sell it at if you were going to move it. So interesting. And look, there are alternative investments. Go on.
So, the thing I would say that there too is that the only thing that does sell those properties is price. When it's a commodity, when there's a lot of very similar stock around, if there's a lot on the market, which is, and look, I'm talking generally here, you really need to get, and if you wanted to engage us for vendor advisory, we could probably help you. Although, it's a bit of a hard sell really, but the reality is that, if there are a lot on that in the market, in that building, in that complex, in that location, then price is going to be what you need to do. You need to price it to sell it instead of holding out, waiting for the right buyer.
Yep, exactly. And take the hit and then move on. Okay, last scenario, which is sort of a bit more of the same but slightly different. This is Leo off the plan. So looking to buy a house off the plan in Western Melbourne, probably about Point Cook, something like that. Finances are pretty strong, but nervous about the commitment and the builder. So what are the questions to ask? And given the current problems with builders failing and costs rising, would it be better to go for an existing house? We like the idea of new, but...
In Melbourne, right? So Melbourne stretches, it's probably bigger now, but last time I heard that apparently it stretches 100 kilometres from point, from one point to the other. Like it's a big city that's flat, and it's going going to meld into the edges of Victoria soon. So there are subdivisions and new suburbs being created a long way away from the CBD where there's not a lot of infrastructure. So you're going to have to be in a car, right, a lot of the time to get anywhere until they build rails and until they build whatever, B lines and buses, whatever they're going to build. So when it comes to Melbourne, this is one of the reasons I think, and I've spoken to Kate Baycross, for example, who's a Melbourne-based buyer's agent, a number of other buyer's agents down there, Jeff McCabe from Wakelands, and a number of buyer's agents down there that I do respect. And so I've got a little bit of a theory that for me personally, rather than live on the outskirts of Melbourne, I'd be looking at Geelong or Ballarat before I would buy on an outer suburb of Melbourne, because the commute via train, now I have this on good authority, I don't live there so I can't attest to this myself, but the commute via train, if you're going to work in the Melbourne CBD, is apparently easier and quicker than trying to schlep it from some of these new outer suburbs that are relying on road transport. So I would just think, look outside the square. I just think too that wherever you can see, if you can do you do your drone, your aerial map, and you look at where could more subdivisions go, then try not to buy there. Try not to buy where you can see where new subdivisions will go. Is my caution, because it's the same sort of principle of Docklands. More buildings can go up, more apartments, all the same as all the others, except that they're newer than yours. Same with new subdivisions and new house and land packages. So,
yeah, and interestingly,
best caution.
One of my suggestions was: have you looked at the development plans for the area, right? Because that will show you the areas that are zoned for expansion, right? And that tells you something quite significant about, well, that means you're going to have lots of neighbours down the road and lots of similar properties, right? Then you've got this issue of failing builders. And, there are so many examples now of half-finished properties because builders have actually gone bust. And there isn't, I don't think there's an easy way out of that at the moment, because builders are still finding it quite difficult. Cost of materials are rising, and therefore the risk attached to a homeland package, particularly in some of these outer suburban areas, are very high. And you're dead right on the commuting. It takes longer than going slightly further out and using some of the trains where, of course, you can sit in the train and do something else rather than actually have to drive in and out. So
also with builds, and look, I'm not so sure about the house and land packages. Are probably not the case. I'm hearing a lot of builders that are saying that they won't do fixed price contracts anymore. They'll only do cost plus. So that puts all the risk. And I get that the builder shouldn't be wearing all the risk either of rising prices. I get that. But there's the purchasers or the buyers got to understand if they're going to wear all of that risk. No control over rising costs. And it's one of the reasons too that like unrenovated houses in some areas can be quite difficult to sell, because people aren't willing to take the risk to buy something that they know that's got all these big question marks around the cost, the availability, the possibilities of renovating. So it is risky, and so I hate risk when it comes to property. I mean, property is a risky game, but there's ways to de-risk yourself, and there's ways to take on huge amounts of risk, often unwittingly, and buying off the plan or house and land packages is one of the most risky approaches to buying property, in my view.
Yeah, and just on the risk, one of the things I've noticed in the last 6 months or so, particularly from those who are less experienced in buying property, they're looking to cut corners. They're not doing the due diligence that you and I would recommend, the structural surveys and the other bits and pieces we've been touching on tonight, because there's a desperation to grab something and get into the market. So unfortunately, there seems to me to be quite a trend of buying the wrong property.
So a couple of things here, and we do see this in areas where there's a real upward pressure with prices and real booming conditions. And so I'm hearing this happening a lot, particularly in, say, Brisbane and Perth at the minute. And people will just buy anything to get into the market, there's this, and when you see prices rising as rapidly as they have been in those two cities in particular, we've had a situation in Sydney at times. I mean, 2021 was unbelievable. I remember March 21, you had the prices rose 4% in 1 month. I mean, some years they rise 4%, but 1 month, that's just it's crazy territory, right? So it's quite difficult to get a handle on what you're doing and try to be calm in such frenzied conditions. Now, in both Queensland and in WA, they are known as what's called buyer beware states, right? And what that means is that they have the least amount of buyer protection compared to other states in this country. Tassie is pretty bad too, by the way. But New South Wales and Victoria, for argument's sake, and even South Australia, has fair amount of vendor disclosure. It's not enough, and certainly if you're doing due diligence, you need to learn what else you need to know, and also how to understand what is being disclosed and what to look for there and where the red flags are. But in Queensland and WA, very little is required to be handed over. I mean, Queensland has changed legislation recently, but it hasn't actually been implemented, and nobody actually knows what vendor disclosure is going to be improved. But the current situation is that, you could go and buy a home, and I'll give you one little example. One little example is they don't give you a title search or certificate of title. So you don't actually know what you're buying. It's just not even part of it. So in Queensland, in Perth, you buy it and then you do your due diligence. You've already committed to it. If you don't know what conditions to make your offer, to attach to your offer, if you don't get good advice prior to making your offer, you can inadvertently commit yourself to all sorts of things that you wouldn't be able to get out of once you discover. I'm appalled at the ways in which people buy. And so what happens when the prices are rising and when there's all this pressure, you've got an open house, the first ever open house on a Saturday, and the agents are fielding offers in the afternoon at the open house. They've got buyers throwing offers at them in the open house. I'll buy it unconditional. They'll waive their rights to make it subject to a building and pest inspection, subject to finance even. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And if you just rewind only a few years, there's no way people would commit themselves in such a cavalier way. And so I think people are going to get themselves caught out. People are going to find themselves having committed to properties that have got terrible things wrong with them, perhaps, or, easements that they weren't aware of, all sorts of conditions that they could have known about. But given the fact that they either didn't know what to look for, combined with a hot market where there's this incentive to transact very, very quickly, commit yourself very, very quickly, and the selling agent is not your friend. The selling agent is the vendor's friend, not the buyer's friend, and they're just going to take the easiest and quickest offer and the best offer, without the least amount of terms. So it's very difficult to protect yourself as a buyer under those circumstances.
Well, I actually question whether agents are the vendor's friend as well sometimes, but
sometimes not.
That's another story. Remember that they are behaving in their best interests, right?
They have a fiduciary duty to look after the vendor's best interest. However, they are not remunerated in a way that incentivizes them to do that, because they are only paid if that owner sells, right? So therefore, any advice they give them has to entice them first to list with them and then secondly to sell. And, if at any time the best advice is to tell the owner not to sell, well, let's face it, the sales agent's never going to tell them that because they're not paid to do so.
Exactly right. Well, as we sort of come towards the end of the show, I just wanted to share a couple of other bits of information. This was another chart that was just out today showing that the home value index is remarkably high. The average price in Sydney, 1.17 million, right? The average price in Canberra, 870. The average price nationally, 793,000. But the other interesting data point was this one. This is actually showing you the mix of lending at the moment. This is latest lending. And it shows you that investors are hot to trot at the moment, and they're squeezing out first home buyers, and they're actually also overtaking the owner occupiers if you look at the growth. So that's quite an interesting observation too with regard to the market. And one of my observations is that the market is definitely turning around the investment story. And what I'm seeing is some property investors selling because they can't make it work anymore. Cash flow is not working, capital appreciation. But there are also quite a few property investors beginning to pile in. And in fact, there was this article which was out today saying the market pressure is easing for battling renters because property investors are delivering perhaps a small ray of sunshine to Australia's embattled rental community, with vacancy rates across the ultra squeezed markets easing slightly in June after years of sustained tightening. So I guess I just wanted to get your reaction to this resurgence of property investors and how that's playing into some of the things that you're thinking about at the moment.
There's always a new wave of property investors wanting to get into the market. You know, think way back to the mining boom. You know, there was a bunch of investors that are massively enthusiastic about all those rapid gains, and they all piled in, and then many of them failed to get out in time, and then those people probably burnt to never get back into the property, into investing in property. And then after the sort of the headlines die down, there's always a new generation of enthusiastic investors willing to go into whatever the next flavour of the month is, right? Hobart, you know, was the big one for some time. Now it's Perth. So it's I'd be interested, and I haven't dug into this, but I do know that there's been quite a lot of indications that a lot of people were selling out of investments in, say, Melbourne, Victoria, because of their state government's, you know, land tax, and so there's certain government disincentives.
Yep.
Yeah. And so are they selling out of that area, then they go and buying in Perth? So that means your rental stock in Perth's going to go up, but your rental stock in Melbourne's going to go down. You know, so it's not like an investor sells to an investor. And I guess that's the one observation that I would say. So it is an interesting. I also was sort of, before you turned the chart off, I was remembering back to sort of 2015, just before all the APRA intervention into the to stem the over exuberance of investors in the market, and the chart looks like it's going back in that direction, interestingly enough. So you can sort of see you can see that big fall in investor activity in 2016, the big spike in owner occupier, and of course this is all ratio, isn't it? It's all
this is the proportion.
Total.
That's right. This is the proportion. Yeah.
So so you can sort of see that trajectory, and I think it took a long time. It took a big dive when you think about it, down to 2021. You know, so we are certainly seeing that go back up there. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any intervention at some point. I guess that's the other thing that I'd be wondering about.
It's certainly possible, but I guess I would make the point that the trend in investor lending won't be necessarily helping the RBA in terms of cutting rates.
So, yeah.
So a whole new ball game, right? Rates
make investors even less popular than we are.
Exactly. Okay, so as we come to the end of the show, what would your top 3 observations be then for anybody thinking about playing the property game in Australia at the moment?
I think you've got to learn the rules of the game. Too many people play the property game as they think it should operate, not actually the way it does operate, right? And I equate it, it's like running on the Aussie rules field thinking you're going to play soccer. You know, you got the wrong shape ball for starters, but you know, the goals are different. Like, it's the rules are different, and I think I see a lot of people get involved in you know, their property search or their property thinking even, and it's like their head's spinning because they're like, "This is not the way it should be. It's not the way it should be," and it's like, well, it isn't. It is not the way it should be, but the fact is, it is the way it is. So you've got to learn the rules, and I think, you know, a lot of what we were talking about earlier, the assumptions that you make, are very, very dangerous. And so I think you've got to slow it down. You've got to actually get some good advice. That is difficult to find, granted. It is very difficult to find good property advice. You got to, you've got to take a moment to actually project out where you want to be in, and really 10 years time. I really don't want to encourage anybody to be thinking about buying property with a shorter horizon than 10 years. And you've got to be thinking, will this property serve me for that 10 years? Will that help me leverage up to what I need after that? You've really got to be thinking with a longer lens. And I think that that's really important to really slow down and do that. And I think also it's really important to understand that it's a lot easier than you would realize to lose money in property. Whilst the charts will all show you that prices go up over time, and they do, because that's macro data. Macro data, we talked about macro data before. We talked about some of the big things that impact the property market, and we looked at those charts there that showed the median dwelling, or it's actually the hedonic index, right, for dwellings across the country. And you think that's how much each property is. Well, it is, right? There's not many properties in Sydney that are only 117, or at 1.17? Was that the index? But the point being that there's lots and lots of macro data out there. The headlines are all about the macro. They're all about the big picture, right? And don't pay any attention to anyone who predicts what the property market's going to do, because other than a small handful of people like Martin, who comes up with various scenarios, Lou Christopher's another one, comes up with various scenarios. Look into the assumptions that are made underneath each scenario and sort of get to understand what could happen. So that's opening your eyes up to possibilities. Don't believe anybody that comes out and says that it's going to do this or that, because they're all wrong, at least more often than they are right. Put it that way. In any given year, roughly about 80% of them are wrong, and the ones that are right this year aren't necessarily going to be right next year, right? So the odds of them being right are really, really low. So you have to really look at individual decisions on individual properties, because all that macro data doesn't really help you make an individual decision on the choice of property that's right for you. And so that's really important to do that work, to learn that stuff so that you make better decisions.
Yeah, as we say, there is not a property market. There are property markets, and down to the side of the street and the type of property and the way that it's facing and all of those things, and the local conditions and the planning rules and regs. So one of the things that I often say to people is, have you looked at the local planning maps? Do you understand the rezoning that's just happened and the consequences for that area of rezoning? Or the flood maps, what's going to happen if the flooding that people are expecting, is that going to impact the properties? All of those things are really, really, really important. So to me, it's always about going to the micro and looking at the local and getting the information set, and then being methodical and slow and structured and careful. Because the point is, Veronica, there will always be more property. There will always be more property at some price. So it's not like somebody's giving you a once in a lifetime offer that will never, ever be repeated. That, of course, is precisely the way that the agents want to present it, right? You've never seen anything like it. It's the best property in the entire world. That is marketing BS, right? The truth is that the property market is a game. And if you don't understand the rules, you can get burnt. You can fall off the ladder. You can basically find yourself, losing money significantly. On the other hand, you can also win. And, I've done reasonably well in property over the many years that I've been in the marketplace. But it does take effort. It does take work. And you need to understand the rules of the game.
Yeah, that's it. And you don't want to rely on luck. Luck does exist in the property space. It does. I see people luck the timing. I see people luck that they actually managed to buy a really A-grade asset. But you don't want to be relying on luck. You really need to do the work. It's a very, very expensive purchase. And I'm amazed at how many people are so cavalier about it. Really, you've got to take the time to get it right. And if you do get it right, it can be extremely rewarding, and you will be better off financially as a consequence of that. So it's worth it. It's definitely worth it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think with that thought, Veronica, I want to say thank you very, very much for spending another evening with us here on the show. You talk so much sense about property, and it's really, really important that people listen. If people want to find out more about your services and all those things, where is the best place for them to go?
Thank you, Martin. Look, you can find out everything I'm up to at veronicamorgan.com.au. It's a triage site, if you like, so that will point you to my buyer's agency if you want to buy in Sydney. Also, homebuyeracademy.com.au. You can go there via my website, or you can go there directly. If you want to look at the course for first home buyers, it's not just for first home buyers that do that course. If you really want to learn the process of buying a property, you want to do it yourself, better than a lot of buyer's agents will, let me tell you, then learn the process put together by two buyer's agents, Megan and myself, to actually teach you how to methodically go through that process and cover off all the due diligence that you need to do to buy a property without making big mistakes. So they're the two areas that I point you to. My website, veronicamorgan.com.au, will get you to all of them.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts once again. And I look forward to catching up with you down the track as we always find there's more to talk about when it comes to property. But I'll say thank you very much. I'm going to take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Thanks. There you go, folks. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed that. And Veronica, of course, huge insight. And those sites are really, really worth exploring. Just to say that next week, I'm going to have Tender Lacantro back on. I saw him in the chat earlier on. It's going to be interesting conversation with him about what's going on in the marketplace. And we might touch on Perth property as well at that point. And just before I go, I can show you that the dogs, well, we've got one dog. Luna is half out of a basket. Meteor is down under the desk here. So that's half a dog. And I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us on this Tuesday, and I hope you found that useful. Please share, like, and subscribe. And look forward to seeing you next week on the live show, and of course, recorded shows during the week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.